Okay, in this video, we're going to focus on the dermis. So in the previous video, we talked a little bit about the epidermis and the 5 layers found in the epidermis. We learned that it was made up of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Now, deep to the epidermis is the dermis. And unlike the epidermis that does not contain vascular tissue, we find blood and lymph vessels in the dermis. We also find some other accessory structures. So we find hair follicles, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, nails, and dendritic cells. We're going to talk specifically about some of those accessory structures at the end of this video. Now, the dermal layer is made up of types of connective tissue. So whereas we had 5 layers of the epidermis, we really only have 2 layers that we find in the dermis. So the deepest layer of the epidermis is the reticular layer, and then the layer above that or superficial to that would be the papillary layer. So if we look at our figure on the right, and if we sort of could peel up, right, that top epidermis and lift it up, we would see those, it's hard to see, but those little wavy lines, right, those ridges are part of that most superficial layer called the papillary layer of the dermis. And it's named that because those ridges, right, are what form the singular, a papilla or plural papillae. Below that or deep to that is the other layer of the dermis called the reticular layer. Now remember, the hypodermis, which is this layer that's filled with adipose tissue and some loose areolar connective tissue, it's not part of the integument, but it's shown here just to show you how those layers interact with one another. So in the dermis, we see blood vessels, blood capillaries. We can see some sweat glands, hair. We even see this smooth muscle, erector pili. We'll talk about that later in this video. So the first layer we'll discuss is the reticular layer. So this is the deeper layer, deep to the papillary layer. So reticular means a network. So this appears sort of net-like because of the crossing of these different protein fibers that are present in this connective tissue. So this is the thickest layer of the dermis. The papillary layer is not quite as thick. And this layer is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. So if you'll remember, this is mostly the collagen fibers, right, are not running parallel like they are in the dense regular connective tissue. So we have them running in different directions. So what that does is make for a very strong connective tissue that can stretch or that resists stretching in multiple directions. So collagen is going to be present. This is part of what keeps it strong. It also can bind water for hydration. Now, the collagen fibers that are present in this layer are going to extend both deep to this layer into the hypodermis, and they're going to extend into the more superficial, the papillary layer. So that is going to help to connect, right, all of those layers together. It does have some elastin protein fibers also that provide some of our stretch. So when you lift your skin, right, on your hand or on your arm, kind of pinch it up, it has the ability to go back in place because of some of the elastin proteins that are in your skin. Now, we've already mentioned that in the dermal tissue, we have vascular tissue. So in this layer, we have vascular tissue, we have hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and we'll find sweat glands. Now, we will talk when we get to the nervous system more specifically about the types of sensory and sympathetic nerves that are present in this layer. So the papillary layer is more superficial to the reticular layer, and it is made up of a different kind of connective tissue. It's made of loose areolar connective tissue. Now, the reason it's called papillary, remember, is because of these dermal papillae that are formed, these wave-like structures. And so the dermal tissue, it's called, so a single one would be a dermal papilla, but multiple would be dermal papillae. In the epidermis, so the part of the epidermis that meets the dermal papillae would be called the epidermal ridges. And I think I've said this many times, that this causes extra surface area for better connections. Now, the dermal papillae also have sensory nerve endings, especially for tactile light touch receptors. We do have capillaries in the dermal papillae, and remember, the epidermis is completely avascular. There aren't capillaries in the epidermis, so it relies on the capillaries that are in this papillary layer as a source for gases and nutrients to diffuse. Now, we know that in connective tissue, fibroblasts are those cells that are producing those proteins, so collagen and elastin. So those cells are present in this tissue. We have a few of these adipocytes. Remember, these are the cells that have adipose or lipids. And as I mentioned, we have blood vessels and lymph capillaries. They contain some nerve and touch receptors. Specifically, I'll point out to you something called Meissner corpuscle. And we have some immune activity. So we have some phagocytes present in this layer. Now we're going to look at more models and more histology in the lab section, but we'll look a little bit today as we go through the lecture. So first thing, every time I look at a tissue sample with the integument, I'm always looking for the papillae, right? That's kind of my go-to to sort of find out what's going on in this image. So I'm going to recognize where the papillae are. So I know that the top part of those waves is going to be my epidermis, right? So all of this up here, right, that's my epidermis. And we can see here, this is the dead, right? The dead keratinized, like the corneum layer up here, right? These cells are eventually going to be sloughed off. So what that means is this layer here, okay, from about right here, all of this light pink color, these are the dermal papillae, which means that's the papillary layer of the dermis. Now remember, it's made of, let me just erase that so we can see it better. It's made of loose areolar connective tissue. And you can see microscopically that there is a difference. If we sort of draw a line right here, we can see that this tissue below this line has a different appearance, this connective tissue, than that of the dermal papillae. So down here, we have dense, irregular as part of the reticular layer. And up here, I don't have a lot of room to write it, but we have the loose areolar connective tissue in the dermal papillae. Okay? Now, collagen is present in both layers, right? It's the type of connective tissue, the way the collagen is arranged, how much collagen and how it's arranged. But as I mentioned, we do have collagen that extends, right, through the layers to make those connections better. All right, now we know that the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer is not technically part of the integument, but we want to talk about it because it's the layer deep to that. Excuse me. It's mostly made of adipose tissue and loose areolar connective tissue. Now remember, there is some collagen fibers that are going to extend from that deeper layer of the dermis, the reticular layer, into the hypodermis, anchoring those two, connecting those together. What's the purpose of the hypodermis? Well, if we think about it, it's made of mostly adipose or fat, right? Well, we know that that's our energy reserve. Fat is that's our long-term energy source or storage form. It makes sense. We know that fat probably is going to give us some padding and protecting, and we know that it provides insulation. And it helps to bind the integument to underlying tissue. Now, you've all heard of the hypodermic needle, right? So the reason it's called the hypodermic needle is the purpose is to reach this layer, the hypodermic layer. Why do you suppose we would want to reach this layer? So if we just look at this figure, what we can see is we have quite a bit, right, of vascular tissue. So it makes it a great way for medications or things to be absorbed in this layer into the bloodstream. now we're going to shift gears. We've gone through first video, we talked about the epidermis. Now we've covered the dermis and the hypodermis. Now let's look at some of the accessory structures that are present in these different layers. So examples are nails, hair. We have exocrine glands. So types of exocrine glands. We have sweat glands, and actually the sebaceous glands are also a type of exocrine gland. So hair, it's also made of dead keratinized cells. So we have the same sort of process in that we have cells divide and push up, and then at the top we only are left with these dead cells full of keratin. So we have the bulb, right, where the hair is going to originate, and then we have the root that goes all the way from the bulb to the surface. So we could say the root. And then we have the shaft. Okay, so the part from the surface would be the shaft. And then one thing I want to point out to you, part of your study guide mentions that the integument contains all 4 tissue types. And so it might throw you for a minute when you're thinking, well, what kind of muscle tissue is there? Well, here's an example. This erector pili muscle is shown right here, connected to this hair. It's a type of smooth muscle. Oh, excuse my writing there. Smooth muscle. And this is the cause of goosebumps. So when this muscle contracts, it essentially causes the hair to stand up. So that would be an example of muscle tissue in the integument. All right, let's talk sweat glands. So there's 2 types that I want you to know, and there's the eccrine, which you might see listed also as merocrine, okay? And then the apocrine. Now let's talk about the difference between these 2. So the eccrine sweat glands are those that are found all over your integument, all over your skin. They produce a secretion that is mostly water, like 99% water. But it has some electrolytes or some salts, right? And that's if you sweat on your face and it runs down into your mouth, it tastes kind of salty. That's right, because of these electrolytes, sodium chloride. We also have some urea that can be secreted along with the water and the electrolytes. Now, this is part of your homeostasis, your thermal regulation. If you get hot, then your eccrine sweat glands will produce this sweat on the surface of your skin, which evaporates and helps to cool your body, right? So part of the role there, or a big role of that, is in your thermal regulation. Now, they have a duct that carries the secretion to the surface. So a tube or a duct. So this right here on the figure, this right here would be the actual, let me change my color. Let me see what color might work best. Actually, I think I'll just use black. So this here would be the sweat gland, the eccrine sweat gland. Sorry, say that 3 times fast. Now, notice here is the duct that's carrying the secretion all the way to the surface. Now, our next example is an apocrine sweat gland. This also has a duct. However, it's not released to the surface. It's typically released onto a hair follicle. So this one, you see the sweat gland itself is a little bit larger than the eccrine sweat gland. And here's the duct. And it is releasing the secretion onto this hair shaft or onto the hair follicle. Now, we don't find these sweat glands everywhere. We find them in the axillary region. Do you remember where that is when you're thinking about your region? So think about Axe, okay? Deodorant, it's in the armpits, right? And then in the genital region. This is more than just water. Yes, it has water and electrolytes, but it also contains a secretion of some proteins and some lipids or fats. And this is basically a food source for bacteria. So that when we think about BO, right, body odor, and that's the way I remember it. So APO, BO, right? That helps you remember that one. The bacteria feed on this food source of protein and lipids, and it's the bacteria that cause the odor. So that's the difference between those two sweat glands. All right, our sebaceous glands, sometimes called holocrine glands, these produce something called sebum. Okay, and this sebum is not water. It's actually an oily or waxy or hydrophobic substance. Okay, it is not released directly onto the surface. It's released also onto a hair follicle. So a sebaceous gland, so you see this right here extending from the hair follicle. There'd be gland here. So this is a cross section. We can see it here. We can see it here. Those are all sebaceous glands releasing that sebum onto the hair follicle. These are not made the entire life. They actually go into production at puberty. Same thing with the apocrine glands, right? We see those beginning to happen around puberty. The point of this is going to be lubrication, right? This oily, waxy substance. These, when these get infected or get clogged, is when we start to see acne, right, on the skin. All right, and then we'll just talk for a second about some tactile receptors. And again, we're going to get into more detail about this when we talk about senses and nervous tissue. But so we're just locating some of these while we're looking at the integument. I have 3 listed for you. So we have the Merkel cells, remember that we mentioned earlier when we were talking about our epidermal tissue. So we have the Merkel cells, sometimes called tactile cells, and these are present more in really sensitive areas like fingertips because these are for light touch. So think about like when you're maybe shopping for, I don't know, clothes or a blanket or something, and you kind of feel the texture of the clothing or the material. That would be those tactile cells. Then we have Meissner's corpuscles, or sometimes called tactile corpuscles. So these are found in the dermal papilla, so that papillary layer of the dermis. These are also for light touch. Now these are shown on the model, so I'm just going to... The tactile corpuscles are these yellow, structures right here. Now, notice I can tell because the epidermis is in dark blue, right, in this layer. So we see that wavy pattern. I know if it's in the dermal papilla, it's got to be below that blue, right? Because the dermal papillary layer is the one that's right up to those epidermal ridges. Now, another type of tactile receptor is the lamellated corpuscles. Okay, so these are deeper. So this right here would be an example. Here's a cross section. Okay, so in other words, we cut it right down the middle. These are going to be deeper, so it's going to take more pressure, more coarse type touch that they're going to recognize. Now, these are still in the dermis, but they're not in the papillary layer. They're found deep in the reticular layer of the dermis.